Who really holds the power in Washington, D.C.? How do the political systems actually work? It's really very simple. The federal United States is a corporation and a national government both. When the federal government went bankrupt for the first time in 1930, which may be news to some people, but to others it's not news. But the government has been bankrupt 7 times in this century. And every time the federal government goes bankrupt, it has to reorganize. It has to raise the debt ceiling and go begging to the Federal Reserve to borrow some more money to keep the doors of the power structure open a little longer. Now, if you are a bankrupt company, corporation, or individual, who directs your affairs? Your creditors do. A bankrupt entity no longer has the legal power or authority to direct its own affairs. Every time the federal government went bankrupt, it had to transfer its authority over to its creditors in order to reorganize the assets to resolve the bankruptcy to the satisfaction of the creditors. But more than that, it's behind the power structure. The invisible power structure here is pulling the strings of the creditors, who are in fact then directing the United States federal government. The real significant bills and the real significant budgets are directed lock, stock, and barrel by the creditors. We either fund them or we don't fund them. It's as simple as that. If you wonder why they're building prisons instead of schools and they had to cut the lunch program, it's because that's the agenda of the creditors of the federal United States. We can afford to build prisons, no problem. We can afford to put 100,000 new revenue agents out on the street, call them police, but what we're really doing is trying to raise some more revenue to keep the government open. So be very clear that it's the creditors of the federal United States, which is the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the sovereign powers behind that are the creditors who are directing it. Prior to 1913, the American people had direct veto power against spending policies of the federal government, because in order for the federal government to borrow any money, it had to go to the people. There was no central bank it could go to. It had to sell bonds. If you didn't want to go to war, you didn't buy the bonds. If you didn't want this pork project that the government had in mind, you didn't buy the bonds. It was a very simple system, a Republican system whereby you had veto power, economic veto power. And it worked very well until 1913. That's how come government managed to stay small, because it didn't have an unlimited credit line to go on a shopping spree for 80 years and make you pay for it. So in 1913, there was this convenient new arrangement made. The Federal Reserve Act created an unlimited credit line for the federal United States government to borrow directly from the Federal Reserve Bank, and obligated the American people to pay it back, completely bypassing what was our veto power, and they no longer had to come to us directly to ask permission to fund something. They went directly to the bank. Now, if you go to the bank and want to borrow some money, what do you got to do? You got to put collateral up, right? They're not going to give you a $5,000 loan if you have no collateral, if it's unsecured. You're going to have to put up your house, your car, or your land or something, right? Well, it's no different for the government, except the government doesn't have any assets. That's the difference. And so instead of putting up the assets they didn't have, they put up your assets. They said, here, we'll make you a deal. You lend us all the money, and we're going to collateralize first the gold, and then the land, and then the corporations, then the national parks and forests, then the birth certificates, until we've collateralized all the tangible property in the United States of America. It only took 17 years under this new arrangement for the federal United States to go bankrupt the first time. Only 17 years before they couldn't service the debt, the interest on the debt of the money that they had borrowed. It's an unpayable debt. Can't be paid. All the lip service about balancing the budget, it cannot be paid. It is unsustainable. There was never any provision in the Federal Reserve Act for ever paying the principal. Ever. 16 nations went bankrupt after World War I. And this was one of them, the United States, federal United States. And so when the country went bankrupt, it precipitated the Great Depression, which was also manipulated and created by the international bankers to demoralize the people, number one, but also to shift power away from the sovereign people, to shift the land away, and to shift the gold away from the people and into the hands of the international bankers and the sovereign power structures behind them. So in 1933, with House Joint Resolution 192, on the floor of Congress, the Federal United States declared bankruptcy and no longer could service debt with gold because it had no more. And so it then made what we call now legal tender, or fiat money, a money paper substitute, and then decreed that, well, since we don't have any gold, we'll just have to use paper instead. So you basically traded gold for paper. What a great deal. That was the first bankruptcy. And ever since that point, we have been proceeding down the road of an exponential debt curve whereby there is only one possible conclusion of an economic system set up on an unsound and unsustainable basis, which is bankruptcy. Not just for the government, but for all the people as well. And so the federal government went bankrupt, and every time it's gone bankrupt, it's transferred more of the assets of the American people over to the international bankers. Jimmy Carter transferred all the birth certificates as collateral against the national debt to the international bankers when he was president. They took your birth certificate as a security and a trust instrument that it is, and gave it to the international bankers as collateral so they could borrow more money. So your labor, your effort, your work, all of your life will never belong to you. The international bankers own it all. And because the American people are not aware of the nature of ownership, the nature of titles, the nature of sovereignty itself, we allow that to happen. A deed is not title. You do not have title if you have a deed. You can pay your mortgage for 30 years and you will not own your property. You only have a deed. A deed is not a title. A title is the land patent. It's called an allodial title. You lost the allodial title the minute you collateralized your land and borrowed money and put up your land as security against it. It's a condition of every bank contract that the allodial titles reverts to the federal government as a condition of every bank contract and mortgage in this country. But you didn't know that. Go ask the title insurance companies. They know, but they won't tell you because they're engaged in monumental fraud, that's why. The only thing that has kept our standard of living afloat for the last 40 years is because the dollar has been artificially floated by the central banks of Europe because they wanted to maintain the productivity of the American people until, one, they confiscated all the property, and number two, they'd installed the police state to police the residue and the social disintegration that would result once the bankruptcy was finally declared. That is the only political agenda, that's the only economic agenda, and it's the only legal agenda at this point. To make a very complex story very simple, bankruptcy is the key word. When the country went bankrupt the first time, we went off of the common law. Prior to 1938, all the law that was practiced was common law. As long as you had the sovereign people, the sovereign states, and the common law, and a constitutional money system, the republic is in order. When the sovereign people begin disappearing, when the country goes bankrupt, then the common law disappears, and then you have negotiable instruments law or bankruptcy law. Ever since 1938, we've been dealing in the Uniform Commercial Code, negotiable instruments law, law of the law merchant, the international law of the high seas. And the law of the creditor is admiralty. Admiralty jurisdiction, maritime procedure. The sovereigns do not exist on the land. They exist on the sea, in between nation states, in legal structures that exist under admiralty and maritime. All the power structures that are sovereign do not have allegiance to nation states. The nation states are their servants. They are created as ships of state to execute the sovereignty. The sovereign powers have always used the admiralty jurisdiction and maritime procedures to execute their procedures. That is the only thing going on in the courts today. All issues of traffic revenue, and insurance are admiralty. And in an admiralty proceeding, which most people don't understand because they can't conceive of it, they think that, one, we still have a Constitution and a Bill of Rights, and it's the law of the land, and we have common law, and we have rights, and we have due process, and there's actually procedures here that follow the constitutional standards. There are none. Remember, there is no Constitution or Bill of Rights without the sovereign people. There is no common law in a bankrupt country. There's only admiralty law. In 1933, when the country went bankrupt, it declared a perpetual state of national emergency, which was bankruptcy. We have been in a perpetual state of national emergency since 1933. There have been 470 consecutive states of emergency. Under admiralty jurisdiction and maritime procedures, when you get a traffic citation, it is a maritime procedure. When they are impounding your property, it is a maritime procedure. When they have forfeited your land, it is a maritime procedure. But they don't tell you that. They play games and they pretend with you. The second they seize your property, they've executed an admiralty claim. They seized your vessel or your vassal. A vassal is a slave. You'll look on the California registration, you'll see the registration is for vessels. All of your property is a vessel, whether it's on land or on sea. And an admiralty proceeding is initiated at the moment that they seize your vessel or your body, which is their property, and a vessel as well, when they arrest you. Then what the courts do is they shift from admiralty to equity, without telling you. And now they perform under a quasi-contract. Because in an admiralty contract, if it was an admiralty jurisdiction, there would have to be a signed international contract in force. But they know there isn't one with your name on it. But there is one with the name of the Federal United States on it. And since you're a subject of the Federal United States, the Federal United States is subject to its creditors. The creditors are the insurance underwriters of the debt of the Federal United States, executing an admiralty claim in the court systems. Your accuser is the International Monetary Fund for a simple traffic citation. And who is the proctor? The proctor in an admiralty proceeding is the U.S. attorney. In fact, all the attorneys are proctors, acting on behalf of the creditors. In a bankruptcy, the Secretary of the Treasurer is a receiver in a bankruptcy who is also the governor of the International Monetary Fund. So the International Police Organization, Interpol, is the police arm of the creditor, the International Monetary Fund, and they are your accusers. They're trying to collect on a debt that the federal government owes and you owe because you're a U.S. citizen. There's only one agenda. It's very simple. They just want to control the world. It's very simple. And they're using every means at their disposal. Political means, economic means, legal means, military means, police means, media, propaganda, deception, distraction, demoralization, terrorism, whatever. I happen to presently believe that left or right is irrelevant. That it makes no difference. And we've got to stop pointing fingers at liberals or conservatives or Republicans or Democrats, and all that is a distraction that keeps the American people divided from the real issues and the real ones who are trying to take over here. And I find that to be a healthy sign that in the lectures and in the workshops that I do, that it is not a homogeneous group. That there are all kinds of Americans coming to these groups. And people who genuinely disagree with each other. And that's fine. How else are you going to learn anything unless you dialogue with somebody who you don't agree with? But you can have a healthy communications if you have a healthy listening and the ability to listen to someone else. You might really learn something. That everybody has a piece of the truth. Everybody knows a little bit of it. And our job is to put it all together so we can make sense of it.